In the farthest reaches of wild space beyond the light of known stars, there once stood a throne that no mortal hand could claim. Upon it sat a being who had lived for 5,000 years, wearing 3 different faces, ruling 3 separate empires, consuming the life force of entire worlds to sustain an existence that should never have been. His birth name was Tenebrae. The Sith knew him as Lord Vitiate, the Immortal Emperor who led them into the unknown regions. The people of Zakuul worshipped him as Valkorion, their eternal god-king who brought prosperity and power. But beneath these masks lived something far more terrifying. A consciousness that had murdered 8,000 Sith Lords in a single ritual, draining an entire planet of all life to achieve what no other had dared: true immortality. For 50 centuries he shaped the fate of the galaxy from the shadows. He corrupted Jedi, bred Force-sensitive bloodlines like cattle, and built empires that rose and fell according to his incomprehensible designs. He fathered children he could never truly love, ruled worlds he had grown too ancient to understand, and consumed thousands of lives simply to continue existing. But here is the question that haunts the ancient records. What happens when an immortal realizes that eternal life is not freedom, but the cruelest prison imaginable? What drives a being of infinite power to engineer his own destruction? Tonight we journey through the complete story of the galaxy's most terrifying immortal. From the moment a 10-year-old boy murdered his own father and claimed a planetary throne, to the final desperate gambit 5 millennia later, when he would sacrifice everything, even his own existence, to escape the cage of eternity. Before we begin this epic journey through one of Star Wars' most complex and fascinating characters, I need to share something. About 62% of you watching right now haven't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into Star Wars lore and sleep stories, hitting that subscribe button genuinely helps this channel grow and lets me create more content like this. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Seriously, it blows my mind every time I see people from different continents all gathered here for these stories. So go ahead, get comfortable. Dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Pull up your blanket and let's ease into tonight's journey together. This is a story 5,000 years in the making. Our story spans an almost incomprehensible stretch of time, from approximately 5,113 years before the Battle of Yavin, when a child named Tenebrae first opened his eyes on the Sith world of Nathema, all the way to 3,637 before Yavin, when the being who wore his consciousness would finally meet obliteration. 50 centuries of manipulation, conquest, transformation, and the slow hollowing out of whatever humanity might have once existed in that ancient soul. The primary stage for this tale shifts across 3 distinct locations, each representing a different face of the same immortal entity. First, there is Nathema, originally called Medria, a world in the ancient Sith Empire. Once lush with dark side energy and teeming with Sith civilization, it would become something else entirely. A planet of absolute silence. No sound, no force presence, no life whatsoever. Just endless cities of stone standing empty beneath a sun that shines on nothing. Walking through Nathema's ruins is like moving through a galaxy-sized tomb. The air itself feels wrong, as if the universe holds its breath in this place. Even the Force recoils from it, leaving a void so profound that Jedi who venture here describe feeling utterly alone, cut off from the cosmic energy that connects all living things. Second, we travel to Dromund Kashas, the hidden capital of the Sith Empire, shrouded in eternal thunderstorms. Here, dark spires rise through perpetual rain, lightning illuminating ancient Sith architecture every few seconds. This is where Lord Vitiate, the Sith Emperor, held court for over a millennium. From a throne room that few were ever permitted to enter, he whispered commands that would echo across the galaxy. The planet itself feels alive with dark side energy, crackling with malevolent power accumulated over thousands of years of Sith rituals and sacrifice. And finally, Zakuul, a civilization flourishing in wild space, completely unknown to both Republic and Empire for millennia. Golden spires reaching toward alien stars, advanced technology that seems almost magical, and at its heart, the eternal throne. Here, the being called Valkorion ruled as beloved emperor, a wise and powerful leader who guided his people to unprecedented prosperity. The contrast could not be more stark. Where Nathema is death and Dromund Kaz is darkness, Zakuul shines with light and order, its citizens living in peace under the protection of their immortal god-king. Our focus throughout this journey is the consciousness that moved between these worlds, wearing different identities like masks, but always remaining fundamentally the same. A being who began as a child of terrible potential and became something the galaxy had never seen before. Not quite Sith, not quite a Force entity, but an immortal standing outside the normal flow of life and death, watching civilizations rise and crumble like waves against an eternal shore. The world, then known as Midria, has existed as a jewel within the ancient Sith Empire, rich with dark side energy, and ruled by powerful Sith lords who traced their lineages back to the original exiles from the Galactic Republic. Among these rulers stood Lord Dramath, a formidable Sith whose mastery of the Force had earned him absolute control over the planet. His fortress dominated the landscape, a monument to his power and his unwillingness to bend knee to any higher authority, even the reigning Dark Lord of the Sith. In the year 5113, before the Battle of Yavin, Dramath's consort gave birth to a son. The child entered the world on a night when the planet's 3 moons aligned, casting strange shadows across the birthing chamber. From his first breath, the infant displayed characteristics that unsettled even the hardened Sith attendants present. His eyes, when they opened, seemed to perceive far more than any newborn should. The midwives would later whisper that the child never cried, not once, but simply observed everything around him with an intelligence that felt ancient and profoundly wrong. Dramath named his son Tenebrae, a word meaning darkness or shadow in one of the old Sith tongues. It was meant as a declaration of pride, a promise of the legacy this child would inherit. The Sith Lord could not have known he was naming his own executioner. As Tenebrae grew, his connection to the Force revealed itself as something unprecedented. By age 4, he could move objects with his mind that grown Sith struggled to lift. By 6, he had independently discovered techniques of Force manipulation that typically required decades of training to master. But more disturbing than his raw power was the complete absence of normal childhood emotion. He felt no affection, displayed no fear, showed no hesitation when witnessing or inflicting pain. Where other children might cry or laugh or rage, Tenebrae simply watched, calculated, and remembered everything. Lord Dramath recognized his son's potential, but also sensed the danger inherent in such a prodigy. He attempted to control the boy through brutal discipline, inflicting punishments that would have broken lesser beings. Tenebrae endured it all without complaint, without tears, absorbing every lesson about power and its application. In private moments, he began his own experiments. Servants in Dramath's household started disappearing. Small animals were found drained of life in hidden chambers. The boy was teaching himself things that even experienced Sith considered forbidden, delving into aspects of the dark side that required not just power, but a willingness to view living beings as nothing more than resources to be exploited. The turning point came when Tenebrae reached his 10th year. By then he had grown tired of his father's authority, tired of bowing to anyone's will but his own. He had discovered something in the ancient Sith texts stored in Dramath's library. Fragmentary references to rituals that predated the modern Sith Order, techniques used by the original Dark Jedi exiles who had first conquered this region of space. These rituals spoke of transferring life essence, of consuming the force energy of others to magnify one's own power exponentially. On a night much like the one when he was born, Tenebrae walked calmly into his father's meditation chamber. Drymath was deep in communion with the dark side, his guard lowered in the supposed safety of his own fortress. The boy struck without warning, without hesitation, without mercy. What happened in that chamber over the following hours would remain known only to Tenebrae himself. But when dawn broke, Lord Drymath was dead, not simply killed, but utterly drained. His body lay withered like ancient parchment, every trace of force energy stripped away and consumed by his own son. Tenebrae emerged from the chamber changed. The servants who saw him described eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire, a presence that pressed against their minds like a physical weight. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a child's throat, as if multiple voices spoke in unison. He walked through the fortress and claimed his father's throne without opposition. Those few guards and Sith apprentices who considered resistance found themselves paralyzed by the sheer crushing weight of the boy's power pressing down on their consciousness. At 10 years old, Tenebrae became the undisputed ruler of Medria. His first edicts demonstrated a mind that thought in long time scales and grand designs. He consolidated power by eliminating potential rivals, not through crude assassination, but through careful manipulation that turned enemies against each other. He initiated programs of selective breeding among the force-sensitive population, attempting to cultivate stronger potential hosts for future experiments. He gathered every scrap of forbidden knowledge available on the planet, ancient holocrons and crumbling texts that spoke of powers the modern Sith had forgotten or deliberately abandoned as too dangerous. For over a century, young Tenebrae ruled his world in relative isolation, largely ignored by the Sith Empire's central authority. To the Dark Lords on Korriban and Zeost, Medria's was a backwater, and reports of a powerful but reclusive ruler there seemed unremarkable in an empire filled with ambitious Sith. They had no idea that on this forgotten world something was evolving beyond their comprehension. Tenebrae aged, but slowly, far more slowly than he should have. His experiments in life extension bore fruit, granting him decades that should not have been his. But he wanted more than decades. He wanted eternity. The ancient texts he studied spoke of rituals that could theoretically grant true immortality, but the price was staggering. It would require death on a scale that even the Sith might balk at, the sacrifice of thousands of force-sensitive beings whose combined life energy could fuel a transformation into something beyond mortality. For a normal being, such a ritual would be unthinkable. For Tenebrae, it became an obsession, the singular goal toward which he bent every resource at his disposal. He began making preparations that would take decades to complete, alchemical formulas that needed to be perfected through countless trials, geometric patterns that had to be carved into the planetary bedrock at precise locations. Most crucially, he needed Sith Lords, thousands of them, gathered in one place at one time, their guards lowered, their minds focused on anything except the possibility that they were walking into an elaborate trap that had been over a century in the making. As Tenebrae moved through his second century of life on Medria, as the rest of the galaxy remained oblivious to what was coming, the Sith Empire continued its internal power struggles. Jedi and Sith clashed in their eternal conflict, and ordinary beings lived and died never knowing that on a distant world, a patient predator was preparing to devour an entire planet in pursuit of a prize that would reshape the very nature of existence itself. By the time Tenebrae reached his 109th year, everything was in place. The ritual circles carved into bedrock across 6 continents on Medria, as represented over 8 decades of precise calculation and back-breaking labor by slaves who were executed upon completion to preserve the secret. The alchemical components had been refined through generations of experimentation, with failures buried in mass graves that honeycombed the planet's crust. And most importantly, Tenebrae had identified his fuel source. The year 5000 before the Battle of Yavin brought chaos to the Sith Empire. The Great Hyperspace War against the Galactic Republic was going poorly, and the ancient Sith domains faced potential annihilation. Desperate Dark Lords sought any advantage, any weapon that might turn the tide against Republic forces. Into this atmosphere of fear and desperation, Tenebrae sent his invitation. He claimed to have discovered a superweapon in the ancient ruins of Midria as a force technique of such devastating power that it could annihilate entire Republic fleets with a single application. All he needed was the combined strength of the Empire's greatest Sith Lords channeled through a ritual he had meticulously prepared. The desperate Sith facing extinction saw hope where they should have seen a trap. They came in droves, arriving on Medrias by the hundreds until over 8,000 of the most powerful dark side wielders in the galaxy had gathered on this single world. Tenebrae greeted them with perfect hospitality, directing them to positions across the planet that he claimed were focal points for the ritual. Each Sith Lord was given precise instructions on meditative techniques they should employ, breathing patterns to follow, mental focuses to maintain. They were told this synchronization was essential for the superweapon to function properly. In truth, Tenebrae was positioning them like pieces on a game board, each one a node in a vast web of dark side energy that spanned the entire planet. The ritual began at midnight, when all three moons once again aligned, as they had on the night of Tenebrae's birth. 8,000 Sith Lords settled into deep meditation simultaneously, their combined power creating a resonance in the Force that could be felt light years away. Jedi on distant worlds woke from sleep with unexplained dread. Sensitive beings across the galaxy felt a disturbance, as if reality itself had drawn a sharp breath. For the first hour, nothing seemed amiss. The Sith Lords meditated, channeling their power into the patterns Tenebrae had taught them, believing they were contributing to a great working that would save their empire. Then the ground beneath them began to vibrate, a deep subsonic rumble that built slowly but inexorably. The carved symbols in the bedrock started glowing with a sickly luminescence, lines of power connecting across continents, in patterns that became visible from space. By the second hour, some of the assembled Sith began to feel something was wrong. Their energy was flowing outward as expected, but nothing was flowing back. They were giving and giving, pouring their power into the ritual, but receiving nothing in return. A few attempted to break their meditation and flee, only to discover that the geometric patterns had become a cage. The moment they had begun channeling their power into the ritual, they had become locked into it, unable to withdraw, unable to escape. Panic spread as realization dawned. This was not a weapon against the Republic. This was a feeding frenzy, and they were the meal. The Sith Lords screamed, raged, begged, threatened and pleaded, but the ritual was implacable. Their life force began tearing away from their bodies invisible streamers of energy, golden and crimson rivers of pure vitality, flowing across the landscape toward a single focal point, where Tenebrae stood at the center of the grandest ritual circle. The planet itself began to die. Plants withered in seconds, their green vitality turning to ash gray. Animals collapsed mid-stride as the life was ripped from their bodies. Oceans of microorganisms perished in their trillions, adding their tiny sparks to the vast conflagration of stolen life. Even the force-sensitive crystals deep in the planetary mantle cracked and went dark as their resonance was consumed. Midrias was being murdered, every single living thing sacrificed to fuel one being's ascension to immortality. For 6 unbroken hours, the ritual continued. The screams of 8,000 Sith Lords echoed across a dying world, their voices joining in an unwilling chorus of agony that marked the greatest act of mass murder in galactic history. Their bodies aged rapidly as their life essence was stripped away, flesh withering on bones, bones crumbling to dust, until nothing remained but empty robes scattered across a lifeless landscape. Tenebrae stood at the center of it all, arms outstretched, drinking in an ocean of death. The combined life force of 8,000 Sith Lords, billions of lesser beings, and an entire planetary biosphere flowed into him in a torrent that should have torn apart any mortal vessel. But Tenebrae had prepared for this. His own body had been alchemically reinforced over decades specifically to contain what was coming. The power crashed into him, like a tsunami, rewriting his very essence at a fundamental level. When the ritual finally ended and silence fell across Medrias, what stood in that central circle was no longer truly Tenebrae. The being that remained had transcended mortality entirely, achieving what no Sith before him had managed. True immortality, sustained not by external artifacts or temporary techniques, but by power stolen on such a scale that it would take millennia to exhaust. He had become Lord Vitiate, the Immortal Emperor, a consciousness that could persist indefinitely by consuming additional lives as needed to replenish what time slowly eroded. The planet that had been Medrias was gone in every way that mattered. Renamed Nathema by its sole surviving inhabitant, it became a wound in the Force itself, a place of such profound emptiness that it would persist for thousands of years. No plants would ever grow there again. No animals would ever walk its surface. Even bacteria could not survive in soil so fundamentally drained of life. The very atoms of the planet seemed to carry the memory of what had been done, creating a dead zone in the Force that would horrify Jedi and Sith alike for generations to come. Vitiate stood alone on his dead world, and looked up at the stars with eyes that now perceived time differently than any mortal could comprehend. He had murdered his father at age 10 to claim a single throne. At 113, he had murdered an entire planet to claim eternity itself. The being that had once been a cruel child was now something far more terrifying, an immortal consciousness with ambitions that spanned not years or decades, but millennia. As he prepared to leave Nathema behind forever, Vitiate felt no remorse for the 8,000 Sith he had betrayed and consumed, no guilt for the genocide he had perpetrated. Such emotions belonged to beings who could die, who had to weigh their actions against the finite span of their existence. He was beyond such limitations now. He was eternal, and eternity demanded thinking in scales that would drive mortal minds to madness. The Sith Empire was collapsing under Republic assault. Perfect. From chaos, he would forge a new order, one built entirely according to his design, populated by beings who existed only to serve his incomprehensible purposes. Nathema had been his crucible. What emerged from it would reshape the galaxy for the next 5,000 years. The Great Hyperspace War reached its catastrophic conclusion in the year 5000 before the Battle of Yavin, the same year that Vitiate completed his ascension. The Sith Empire, which had existed for thousands of years, was shattered. Republic forces drove deep into Sith space, destroying temples, toppling Dark Lords, and hunting down the remnants of a civilization built on conquest and dark side philosophy. For the Jedi leading these campaigns, it seemed like a final victory, the complete eradication of their ancient enemies. But the Sith, who survived the Republic's assault, found themselves facing an even more immediate threat to their way of life. Without central leadership, the remaining Dark Lords turned on each other like starving predators, each attempting to claim supremacy over the ruins of their empire. Korriban, the ancient Sith homeworld, became a battleground where former allies slaughtered each other in the tombs of their ancestors. What the Republic had failed to destroy, internal conflict threatened to finish. Into this maelstrom walked Vitiate, traveling from Nathema to Korriban alone and unannounced. When he appeared in the central chamber where the surviving Sith Lords had gathered to argue over who would lead them, the assembled Dark Lords initially dismissed him as another pretender. They saw a relatively young-appearing man claiming authority with no army behind him, no obvious political backing, no power base except his own presence. Their dismissal lasted approximately 30 seconds. Vitiate did not argue his case or present credentials. He simply released a fraction of his power, allowing these supposed masters of the dark side to feel what he had become. The pressure of his presence drove several Sith Lords to their knees immediately. Others clutched their heads as migraine pain spiked through their skulls. The most powerful among them managed to remain standing, but even they felt their connection to the Force bend and warp around this being like light around a black hole. When Vitiate spoke, his voice carried undertones that resonated in frequencies beyond normal hearing. Those who heard it described the sensation of multiple voices speaking in perfect unison, as if thousands of beings spoke through one mouth. Some claimed they could hear echoes of the 8,000 Sith he had consumed, their stolen essences adding depth and power to every syllable. Whether this was literally true or simply the effect of overwhelming Force presence on traumatized minds, the result was the same. When this being commanded, refusal became unthinkable. He told the assembled Sith Lords that their empire was dead and that clinging to its corpse would only ensure their own destruction. The Republic would hunt them to extinction if they remained in known space, but Vitiate offered an alternative. He would lead them to safety in the unknown regions, to worlds beyond Republic reach, where they could rebuild in secret and prepare for an eventual return. All he asked in exchange was absolute obedience. No challenges to his authority, no internal power struggles, complete submission to his eternal rule. For Sith Lords accustomed to the philosophy of taking power through strength, this should have been anathema. The rule of the strong dictated that anyone who could seize control should do so, that hierarchy existed only until someone more powerful overthrew it. Yet faced with Vitiate's overwhelming presence, even the most ambitious Dark Lords found their will to resist crumbling. This was not a being they could overthrow. This was not a leader who would eventually weaken with age, creating opportunity for succession. This was something fundamentally different, and their instinct for survival overrode their ambition. The proclamation was unanimous. Vitiate became the Sith Emperor, the undisputed ruler of what remained of their civilization. Unlike previous Dark Lords who claimed that title through political maneuvering or military conquest, Vitiate's claim rested on something far more primal. He was simply too powerful to oppose, and every Sith present knew with absolute certainty that challenging him meant death or worse. His first command as Emperor demonstrated the long view that would characterize his reign. He ordered immediate preparations for a mass exodus from known space. Every Sith Lord was to gather their followers, their resources, their knowledge, and prepare to abandon the territories that had been Sith domains for millennia. They would leave behind their ancestral tombs on Korriban, their temple complexes on Zeost, every monument to their history. Only by disappearing completely could they ensure survival. The exodus began within weeks. Hundreds of ships loaded with refugees, cultural artifacts, holocrons containing Sith knowledge, and the remaining military assets of the fallen empire. They traveled in groups, taking different routes into the unknown regions to avoid drawing attention from Republic patrols. Navigation was treacherous in that uncharted territory, with hyperspace anomalies and unmapped gravity wells destroying several vessels. But those who survived the journey emerged in regions where the Republic had no presence and no knowledge of their existence. Vitiate himself led the largest contingent, navigating by methods he did not explain. His ship cut through the unknown regions, as if following a map only he could see, avoiding dangers that destroyed other vessels, and finding stable hyperspace routes through areas that should have been impassable. After months of travel, his fleet emerged in a star system dominated by a world shrouded in eternal storms. The planet was called Dromund-Kaz, and it would become the new heart of the Sith Empire. Perpetual electrical storms raged in its atmosphere, generated by massive deposits of force-sensitive crystals in the planetary crust. The native creatures were fierce and aggressive, twisted by dark side energy that saturated the environment. It was hostile, dangerous, and perfect. Here, hidden by storms and distance from any known civilized world, the Sith could rebuild beyond Republic sight. Under Vitiate's direction, the survivors established a new civilization. They carved cities from the jungle, built temples to house their accumulated knowledge, and created a society structured around absolute obedience to the Emperor. But from the beginning, something felt different about Vitiate's rule compared to previous Sith leadership. He was distant, speaking through intermediaries more often than appearing personally. When he did manifest in his throne room, those granted audience reported that his attention seemed divided, as if part of his consciousness was always focused elsewhere. This was not paranoia or imagination. Unknown to the Sith Lords rebuilding on Documentaries, their Emperor's consciousness already stretched beyond that single world. Even as he sat on his throne receiving reports and issuing commands, Vitiate's awareness reached into wild space, searching for something specific among the uncharted stars. He had achieved immortality and claimed an empire, but these were merely foundations for ambitions that would take millennia to fully unfold. The Sith on Documentaries believed they served an emperor focused on their eventual revenge against the Republic, on building military strength for a triumphant return to known space. They could not have imagined that to Vitiate, their empire was just one piece on a game board that spanned the entire galaxy and measured moves not in years but in centuries. He would give them their war eventually, use them for his purposes, but his true attention was already turning toward a different project entirely, one that would require a second identity and a second empire hidden even from the Sith who called him master. While the Sith on Documentaries labored to build their new civilization beneath eternal thunderstorms, Vitiate's consciousness had already discovered something extraordinary in the deepest reaches of wild space. His awareness, no longer bound by the limitations of a single mortal form, could stretch across vast distances through the Force, perceiving worlds and civilizations that existed beyond all known star charts. During one such meditation, he encountered a planet that would change everything. Zakuul existed in a region of space so remote that even the most adventurous Republic explorers had never approached it. The world itself possessed unusual properties. Its connection to the Force felt different somehow, neither purely light nor dark, but something more primal and raw. The native population had developed a civilization of impressive technological sophistication despite their isolation, building cities of gleaming metal and creating governance systems based on meritocracy and strength. They were a warrior culture, but one that valued discipline and order over the chaotic ambition that characterized the Sith. Vitiate saw potential here that Documentaries could never offer. The Sith were useful, certainly, their military prowess and dark side knowledge, valuable tools for his long-term designs, but they were also inherently unstable, constantly plotting against each other, requiring endless management to prevent self-destruction. Zakuul represented something different, a society that could be molded from the beginning according to his precise specifications, populated by beings who had no knowledge of Jedi or Sith, no preconceptions about how the Force should be wielded or what an immortal ruler might demand. What happened next demonstrated the true extent of what Vitiate had become through his ritual on Nathema. Rather than simply conquering Zakuul through military force or manipulation, he chose a far more audacious approach. Using techniques that would have been impossible for any normal Force user, he created a second identity entirely. Not merely a disguise or an assumed name, but a complete separate persona with its own memories, personality, and manner of interacting with the world. This new identity called itself Valkorion, where Vitiate presented himself to the Sith as a distant, terrible god who ruled through fear and overwhelming power. Valkorion would be something entirely different. A wise and benevolent leader, powerful certainly, but one who genuinely seemed to care about the prosperity and advancement of his subjects. The creation of this dual existence required dividing his consciousness in ways that defied normal understanding of how minds and identities functioned. But for a being who had consumed 8,000 souls, such boundaries had become meaningless. Valkorion arrived on Zakuul, not as a conqueror, but as a unifier. The planet at that time was divided among numerous city-states, each ruled by their own warrior elite, periodically warring with each other over resources and territory. He inserted himself into this political landscape gradually, presenting himself as a mediator, a figure of such obvious power and wisdom that the various factions began turning to him to settle disputes. Over the course of several decades, he maneuvered himself into a position where the people of Zakuul themselves asked him to become their permanent leader, to unite their fractured world under a single banner. The Eternal Throne was constructed according to Valkorion's exacting specifications, a marvel of both technology and force-imbued craftsmanship. It served as more than just a seat of government. The throne acted as a conduit, allowing Valkorion to extend his consciousness across his entire domain, to sense threats, to coordinate defenses, to maintain awareness of everything happening within his empire. Sitting upon it, he could be simultaneously present in 1,000 places, his attention divided but never diminished. Under Valkorion's guidance, Zakuul transformed. The separate city-states merged into a unified civilization. Technology advanced at an accelerated pace as Valkorion shared knowledge he had accumulated over centuries, carefully editing out anything that might reveal his true nature. Philosophy and culture flourished as he encouraged art, debate, and the pursuit of excellence in all endeavors. To the people of Zakuul, their immortal emperor was the greatest blessing their world had ever received, a living god who genuinely wanted them to thrive. It was during this golden age of early Zakuul that Senya entered Valkorion's life. She was a knight of Zakuul, one of the elite force users trained to serve as the empire's protectors and champions. Her skill with a lightsaber pike was exceptional, but what truly distinguished her was an unusual combination of fierce loyalty and genuine compassion. Where many warriors served out of duty or ambition, Senya seemed to genuinely believe in Zakuul's ideals and in Valkorion's vision for their civilization. Their relationship developed slowly, over years. Valkorion found himself intrigued by her, though whether this interest constituted actual affection or merely intellectual curiosity about a particularly well-crafted tool was unclear even to him. After millennia of existence, the distinction between feeling emotions and remembering what emotions used to feel like had blurred beyond recognition. Nevertheless, Senya became his companion, eventually bearing his children, and for a time, something approximating a family existed on Zakuul. The construction of the Eternal Fleet represented Valkorion's most ambitious project. In orbital shipyards surrounding Zakuul, thousands of vessels took shape according to designs that incorporated technology far beyond anything the Republic or Sith Empire possessed. These ships were not merely built but grown, using techniques that merged mechanical engineering with force alchemy. Each vessel in the fleet connected to the Eternal Throne through bonds similar to how Valkorion maintained his dual existence, creating an armada that could be controlled by a single consciousness with perfect coordination. The purpose of this fleet remained mysterious even to those who built it. Valkorion assured his people it was for defense, for ensuring that Zakuul would never fall to external threats. In truth, the Eternal Fleet served as insurance for plans that would not come to fruition for thousands of years, a military force so overwhelming that when the time came to reveal Zakuul to the wider galaxy, no combination of Republic and Imperial forces would be able to resist. Throughout all of this, Vitiate maintained his separate existence on Dromund Kaas. The Sith Emperor sat on his throne in the dark, issuing commands to Dark Council members and overseeing the reconstruction of Sith military might. Meanwhile, Valkorion walked the golden streets of Zakul, speaking with citizens, observing the education of force-sensitive children, and building a civilization that gleamed with prosperity. The same consciousness inhabited both bodies, experienced both existences, yet kept them completely separate. The Sith had no knowledge of Zakul. The people of Zakul had never heard of Dromund Kaas or the Sith Empire. Managing this dual existence required constant attention and energy that would have destroyed any normal mind within days. But Vitiate had not been normal for millennia. His consciousness had been so fundamentally altered by consuming 8,000 Sith Lords that concepts like mental strain or divided attention no longer applied in conventional ways. He was everywhere his power reached, a single awareness experiencing multiple simultaneous realities without confusion or diminishment. Yet something strange began to happen as centuries passed. The Valkorion identity started to develop characteristics that Vitiate had not consciously designed. Where the Sith Emperor was uniformly cold and calculating, Valkorion occasionally displayed what appeared to be genuine warmth toward certain individuals. He seemed to take authentic pride in Zakul's accomplishments, to feel something approaching satisfaction when his people prospered. Whether this represented a fragmentation of his original personality or the emergence of something new was unclear, but the two identities slowly diverged in subtle ways even as they remained part of the same fundamental being. Senya noticed these contradictions occasionally, moments when Valkorion's responses seemed inconsistent with his supposed character, times when his eyes held an emptiness that belied his warm words. She never voiced these observations directly, but they troubled her, planting seeds of doubt that would take centuries to fully germinate. She loved the man she believed Valkorion to be, dedicated herself to him and to their shared vision for Zakul. But some part of her always sensed that beneath the beloved Emperor's exterior lived something vast and terrible that she could not fully comprehend. As Zakul's golden age continued, and the eternal fleet grew in the silence of orbital space, Valkorion sometimes stood alone in his throne room and contemplated what he had created. Two empires, two identities, and millennia still stretching ahead to see his ultimate designs through to completion. He had escaped death itself, achieved power beyond any Sith before him, yet the victory felt hollow in ways he could not articulate even to himself. The void that had driven him to consume Nathema remained unfilled by conquest or creation, or the passing of centuries. Perhaps nothing could fill it. Perhaps that emptiness was simply the price of immortality, the inevitable result of existing long enough that all experiences began to feel like repetitions of things already lived. The centuries following Zakul's foundation saw Vitiate's plans unfold with the patient inevitability of glaciers reshaping continents. On Dromund Kaas, the Sith Empire rebuilt itself in secret, growing stronger with each passing generation while remaining completely hidden from Republic awareness. The Jedi believed they had eradicated the Sith threat permanently during the Great Hyperspace War. This ignorance was precisely what Vitiate had counted on, and he nurtured it carefully, ensuring that no Sith vessel ventured into known space, that no communication reached Republic ears. But while his empire remained hidden, Vitiate's influence did not. He had discovered during his long existence that direct confrontation was rarely the most efficient path to achieving goals that spanned millennia. Subtlety and patience produced far more reliable results than brute force. To this end, he created an organization that would become one of his most effective tools over the following 3,000 years. The Emperor's hand began as a handful of the most loyal and capable Sith, individuals whose dedication to Vitiate transcended normal ambition. He subjected these volunteers to rituals that bound them directly to his consciousness, creating a connection that allowed him to speak through them, to see through their eyes, to channel his power across vast distances using their bodies as conduits. They became extensions of his will, sleeper agents who could infiltrate any organization, any government, any institution, and slowly corrupt it from within according to his designs. These agents inserted themselves into Republic society over generations. Some became respected Jedi, their fall to the dark side so gradual and subtle that they never consciously realized they were serving the Sith Emperor. Others rose through political ranks, accumulating influence in the Republic Senate, shaping legislation and policy in ways that would weaken galactic defenses against the eventual Sith return. Still others worked in commerce, manipulating markets and trade routes to concentrate wealth and resources in locations where the Empire could easily seize them when the time came. Vitiate played a game that measured moves in decades rather than days. A seed planted in one generation would bear fruit in the next. A young Jedi corrupted today might train students who would themselves eventually fall, creating chains of compromise that spread through the Order like invisible rot. Political alliances forged through seemingly innocent trade agreements would decades later leave entire sectors vulnerable to invasion. Every action served purposes nested within larger purposes, wheels within wheels that turned according to timescales that would drive ordinary strategists to madness attempting to comprehend. The children of the Emperor represented an even more disturbing application of these principles. Vitiate identified powerful Jedi who possessed specific qualities he found useful, then engineered their corruption through methods that could take years or even decades to complete. Once fallen, these former guardians of the light underwent rituals similar to those used to create the Emperor's hand, but more invasive. Their minds were rewritten, their memories altered, their entire sense of identity restructured around service to Vitiate. They remained in their positions within the Jedi Order, unsuspected, reporting everything they learned back to their true master while believing themselves loyal servants of the light. These sleeper agents provided Vitiate with perfect intelligence on Jedi activities, philosophies, and capabilities. Through them he understood the Order's strengths and weaknesses more thoroughly than the Jedi Council themselves. He learned which masters were most susceptible to doubt, which teachings created psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited, which traditional beliefs could be twisted into justifications for atrocity. This knowledge would prove invaluable when the time came for open war, but more importantly, it allowed him to guide Jedi development in directions that served his purposes. The breeding programs represented perhaps the most coldly calculated of all Vitiate's long-term projects. He had learned from his consumption of 8,000 Sith Lords that Force sensitivity could be concentrated and amplified through careful genetic manipulation across generations. On dozens of worlds throughout both known space and the unknown regions, he initiated programs designed to produce Force users of exceptional potential. Sometimes this involved direct intervention. Agents arranged marriages between specific Force-sensitive individuals whose genetic profiles suggested their children would possess enhanced abilities. Other times, the approach was more subtle, economic incentives that encouraged certain bloodlines to concentrate in particular regions, making it easier to monitor and guide their development over centuries. Vitiate thought of these programs the way a gardener might consider selective breeding of plants, an agricultural project that happened to involve sentient beings rather than crops. The experiments conducted in hidden facilities scattered across Imperial space pushed boundaries that even the most ruthless Sith found disturbing. Vitiate sought to understand the fundamental nature of life and consciousness, to discover whether beings could be created rather than born, whether essential qualities like Force sensitivity could be artificially instilled rather than inherited. His researchers worked with cloning technology, with Sith alchemy, with techniques scavenged from ancient holocrons that predated the Republic itself. Most of these experiments failed, producing abominations that had to be destroyed, or subjects who died screaming as their bodies rejected forced alterations. But Vitiate viewed failure as data, each unsuccessful attempt narrowing the parameters for eventual success. He had millennia to perfect these techniques, and the suffering of experimental subjects meant nothing to a being who had murdered an entire planet. They were resources being expended in pursuit of knowledge, no different than burning fuel to power a reactor. Servants who showed exceptional loyalty were sometimes rewarded with extensions of their natural lifespan, granted through rituals that allowed Vitiate to share minute fractions of the stolen life force he had accumulated. But even this apparent generosity served his purposes. These extended servants remained dependent on him for their continued existence, requiring periodic renewal rituals that ensured their absolute obedience. They also served as test subjects for life extension techniques he might eventually apply more broadly. As centuries accumulated, Vitiate noticed something troubling about his own existence. The immense power he had gained from the anathema ritual was not infinite. It degraded slowly, eroded by the simple fact of maintaining consciousness across such extended time. He needed to periodically replenish himself, consuming additional force users to replace what time wore away. These feedings became more frequent as millennia passed, suggesting that eventually he might require a constant supply of victims simply to maintain his existence. This realization drove some of his most ambitious research. If immortality required endless consumption, then he needed to engineer a permanent solution. The ultimate ritual, one that would transform him into something beyond even what he had become on anathema. He envisioned achieving a state where he no longer needed a physical form at all, where his consciousness could persist as pure force energy, unkillable because there would be nothing physical left to kill. This goal became his true obsession, the ultimate purpose toward which all his elaborate schemes ultimately pointed. On Zakuul, Valkorion's existence continued in stark contrast to the Sith Emperor's dark machinations. The golden civilization flourished, its people living in prosperity and peace, completely unaware that their beloved ruler's consciousness also inhabited the Dark Lord, orchestrating corruption and manipulation across the galaxy. Valkorion walked among his subjects, attended cultural events, presided over ceremonies marking various achievements. To all appearances, he was fully present and engaged with Zakuul's continued development. Yet even there, subtle signs of his true nature occasionally surfaced. Senya sometimes caught him staring at nothing, his expression distant and empty, despite being surrounded by celebration and joy. When questioned, he would smile and deflect, offering explanations that seemed plausible but never quite rang true. She began to notice that he never truly relaxed, never displayed genuine surprise, never seemed to learn anything new despite claiming to value knowledge and growth. It was as if he was performing the role of a living being, rather than actually being one. The weight of centuries was creating a kind of dissociation even Vitiate had not anticipated. With his consciousness stretched between Dromund Kasus and Zakuul, maintaining countless agents across the galaxy, overseeing breeding programs and experiments on dozens of worlds, the concept of a single coherent identity became increasingly abstract. He was simultaneously the Dark Emperor and the Golden King, the ruthless experimenter and the benevolent guide, the patient schemer and the engaged ruler. These contradictions existed within one vastly distributed consciousness without creating obvious conflict, but they were slowly transforming him into something that no longer fit conventional categories of personhood. Memories from his earliest years on Nathema, of being the child called Tenebrae, had faded into something like historical records rather than lived experiences. He could recall the facts of killing his father, of conducting the great ritual, but the emotions that should accompany such memories were absent. He had existed so long that he was becoming a collection of accumulated knowledge and objectives, rather than a being with an authentic inner life. Perhaps this was inevitable for immortals. Perhaps this was why no other Sith had successfully achieved what he had. Not because the technique was too difficult, but because the result was a form of existence that gradually erased everything that made existence meaningful in the first place. The year 3681, before the Battle of Yavin, marked the beginning of what galactic historians would call the Great Galactic War, though in truth, the conflict had been orchestrated and prepared for over 1,000 years before the first shot was fired. The Sith Empire, rebuilt in secret and grown powerful in isolation, finally emerged from the unknown regions to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. For the Republic and the Jedi Order, the return of enemies they thought extinct millennia ago came as a catastrophic shock. Vitiate had prepared this invasion with meticulous care, gaming out scenarios and contingencies that accounted for virtually every possible Republic response. His sleeper agents within the Jedi Order provided perfect intelligence on defensive positions, fleet deployments, and strategic capabilities. The children of the Emperor sabotaged critical infrastructure at precisely coordinated moments, creating chaos that prevented effective organized resistance. When the Sith fleet struck, they did so with surgical precision that spoke to decades of preparation and insider knowledge. The initial assault targeted the Outer Rim territories, worlds far from Coruscant that the Republic had historically struggled to defend effectively. Sith forces moved like a methodical storm, not racing toward the core worlds, but instead consolidating control over each conquered system before advancing. This patient approach maximized their strategic advantage while minimizing the risk of overextension that had doomed previous Sith campaigns. Republic forces scrambled to respond, but found themselves constantly outmaneuvered. Every time they concentrated fleets to defend a critical location, the Sith struck elsewhere. Every time they believed they had identified the invasion's strategic objective, the Empire's focus shifted to a completely different sector. The Jedi Council recognized that they faced not just military superiority, but a level of coordination and intelligence that suggested someone with an incomprehensible grasp of large-scale strategy was orchestrating events. They were correct, though they could not have imagined the truth. From his throne on Dromund Kaas, Vitiate directed the war through the Dark Council, providing guidance that shaped every major strategic decision. His awareness spread across thousands of agents and extended through the Force itself, gave him a battlefield perception that no conventional military intelligence could match. He saw the war from every angle simultaneously, understanding both Sith capabilities and Republic responses with perfect clarity. Entire worlds fell to the Empire as the conflict ground on year after year. Planets that had known only peace for millennia suddenly found themselves occupied by Sith forces, their populations subjected to harsh Imperial rule. The Jedi Order mobilized completely, pulling knights and masters from all across the galaxy to form military strike forces. Temples that had served primarily as centers of learning became staging grounds for war, their meditation chambers repurposed for tactical planning sessions. For the Jedi, this represented a profound crisis beyond the merely military. Their philosophy emphasized peace, negotiation, and only using violence as a last resort. Now they found themselves leading armies, commanding fleets, making decisions that would result in the deaths of thousands. Some masters warned that becoming generals would corrupt the order, that they were abandoning their principles in the name of survival. Others argued that defending the innocent required them to fight, that pacifism in the face of such aggression would make them complicit in the Empire's atrocities. These internal debates weakened the Jedi response in subtle ways that Vitiate had anticipated and counted on. A divided leadership made slower decisions, hesitated at critical moments, second-guessed strategies that might have proven effective. Through his children of the Emperor, embedded within the Order, he carefully nurtured these divisions, ensuring that the most effective military commanders faced constant criticism from more traditional masters who questioned their methods. The war's brutality escalated as years became decades. Space battles left debris fields that would remain navigation hazards for centuries. Orbital bombardments sterilized worlds that had supported billions of inhabitants. Both sides deployed superweapons that previous generations would have considered too terrible to use, each escalation justified as necessary response to enemy atrocities. The galaxy was tearing itself apart, and Vitiate watched with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment in controlled chaos. Then came the stroke that demonstrated the true depth of his strategic patience. In the year 3653 before the Battle of Yavin, as peace negotiations were finally beginning on Alderaan between exhausted Republic and Imperial delegations, Vitiate ordered a surprise attack on Coruscant itself. The Republic capital, considered impregnable and protected by the most powerful defensive fleet in the galaxy, fell to Sith forces in a matter of hours. The attack succeeded because of intelligence provided by agents who had spent decades infiltrating Coruscant's security infrastructure. They knew the patrol routes, the response protocols, the exact locations where defensive systems could be sabotaged to create temporary windows of vulnerability. When the Sith fleet emerged from hyperspace directly above the capital world, alarms that should have sounded failed to activate. Defense platforms that should have opened fire remained silent. Planetary shields that should have protected major cities flickered offline at precisely coordinated moments. The sacking of Coruscant shocked the galaxy. Sith forces seized control of the Senate Tower, occupied the Jedi Temple, and held the entire planet hostage while peace negotiations continued light years away on Alderaan. The message was brutally clear. The Republic could not protect even its own capital. Continuing the war meant watching Coruscant burn while Sith forces methodically destroyed every institution that Republic civilization had built over millennia. Faced with this impossible situation, the Republic Senate agreed to the Treaty of Coruscant, a document that represented complete capitulation to nearly every Imperial demand. Entire sectors of space were ceded to Sith control. The Republic agreed to massive reparations that would cripple their economy for generations. Most devastating of all, the Jedi Order was forced to abandon several temple worlds, withdrawing from territories they had served for thousands of years. The treaty's signing marked what appeared to be total Sith victory, the culmination of 3 decades of brutal warfare. Across Imperial space, celebrations erupted as citizens and soldiers alike rejoiced in their triumph over the ancient enemy. The Dark Council believed they had achieved what generations of Sith before them had failed to accomplish, the complete domination of the Galactic Republic. But Vitiate felt no particular satisfaction. As he observed these celebrations from his throne, the war had never been about conquest for its own sake. It served specific purposes within his larger designs, purposes that the Dark Council members could not perceive because they thought in timescales of decades while he planned in millennia. The conflict had weakened both the Republic and the Jedi Order exactly as he intended, creating the conditions he would need for future operations. More importantly, it had provided cover for activities that remained hidden even from his own Sith followers. During the decades of open warfare, while galactic attention focused on fleet battles and planetary invasions, Vitiate had redirected enormous resources to secret projects that had nothing to do with the military campaign. Research facilities in hidden locations made breakthroughs in techniques he would eventually need for his ultimate ritual. Agents infiltrated both Jedi and Republic institutions at levels that would have been impossible during peacetime. Most significantly, the chaos of war allowed him to acquire Force-sensitive individuals in quantities that peacetime would never have permitted. Test subjects for experiments that advanced his understanding of how life and death, consciousness and force energy interacted at the most fundamental levels. In wild space, far beyond the awareness of Republic or Empire, Zakuul continued its golden existence untouched by the devastation consuming known space. Valkorion walked his capital's gleaming streets, appearing every bit the benevolent immortal ruler guiding his people to ever greater heights. The contrast between the two empires could not have been more absolute. One built on fear and conquest, existing in perpetual thunderstorms on a world of dark temples, the other founded on strength and unity, its golden spires reaching toward clear skies, yet both served the same incomprehensible will. Both existed as components in plans whose full scope remained concealed even from those who believed themselves closest to their architect. Centuries passed on Zakul in prosperity and peace, the world evolving into a beacon of civilization that existed unknown to the war-torn galaxy beyond. During this extended period, Senya remained at Valkorion's side, her loyalty unwavering, despite occasional moments when she glimpsed something troubling beneath his benevolent exterior. Their relationship produced children, and with their births came the closest thing to genuine family that Valkorion had experienced in his 5,000 years of existence. The twins arrived first, born on a night when Zakul's aurora displays painted the sky in brilliant cascades of color. The Xehan and Arkan entered the world within minutes of each other, and from their earliest moments they embodied contrasting aspects of their father's complex nature. The Xehan possessed an innate compassion that seemed impossible given his lineage, a genuine concern for others that manifested even in childhood. He would comfort servants who were distressed, share his possessions with children who had less, and show mercy even when strength would have been easier. Arkan burned differently. Where his brother radiated warmth, Arkan smoldered with intensity and fierce pride. He excelled at everything he attempted, driven by an almost desperate need to prove his worth, to demonstrate that he deserved his father's attention and approval. In combat training, he pushed himself beyond reasonable limits, accepting injuries that would make other students quit rather than admit any weakness. His instructors recognized exceptional talent, but worried about the emotional void that seemed to drive his relentless pursuit of perfection. Valkorion treated his sons with what appeared to be paternal affection, yet something about his interactions with them felt carefully performed rather than spontaneous. He praised their accomplishments, guided their training, and spent time teaching them both philosophy and force techniques. To any observer, he seemed the ideal father, invested in his children's development and genuinely proud of their growth. But Senya sometimes noticed that his responses followed patterns, as if he had studied what fatherhood should look like and was executing those behaviors with technical precision rather than authentic emotion. The Xehan seemed not to notice these subtle incongruities, accepting his father's attention with uncomplicated gratitude. Arkan sensed them acutely, though he could never articulate exactly what felt wrong. This unconscious awareness manifested as escalating efforts to earn validation that always remained somehow incomplete. No matter how impressive his achievements, no matter how perfectly he executed the lessons his father taught, something in Valkorion's eyes stayed distant and unreachable. The arrival of Vaylin shifted the family dynamic in ways none of them anticipated. The youngest child and only daughter, she emerged into the world radiating force energy so intense that attending physicians staggered backward from the delivery table. Even as an infant, her power manifested in ways that defied conventional understanding. Objects moved in her nursery without conscious direction. Energy crackled around her crib when she experienced strong emotions. The force bent around her presence like gravity around a massive star. Valkorion recognized immediately that Vaylin represented something unprecedented. Her raw force potential exceeded even his own at a comparable age, suggesting she might eventually surpass him if allowed to develop without restriction. For a being whose entire existence was predicated on remaining the most powerful consciousness in the galaxy, this presented an unacceptable threat. He could not eliminate her, not without revealing aspects of his nature that would shatter the Valkorion identity he had so carefully constructed. Instead, he chose a solution that Senya would never fully forgive. On a remote moon far from Zakul's populated regions, Valkorion maintained a facility that appeared to be a medical research center but served far darker purposes. He brought Vaylin there when she was barely old enough to walk, explaining to Senya that their daughter needed specialized treatment to help her control abilities that might otherwise harm her or those around her. The explanation seemed plausible on the surface, and Senya's trust in her husband overcame her maternal instincts, warning her that something about this felt fundamentally wrong. What occurred in that facility over the following years constituted systematic psychological torture disguised as therapy. Valkorion's researchers subjected Vaylin to conditioning designed to cripple her ability to access her full force potential. They used a combination of mental manipulation, chemical treatments, and psychological trauma to build barriers within her mind, cages that would contain her power and prevent her from ever becoming the threat she represented. The process required breaking her spirit repeatedly, destroying her sense of self and rebuilding it according to specifications that served her father's needs rather than her own development. She screamed for her mother during the early sessions, cried for Thexan to rescue her, begged Arcan to make them stop. But the conditioning chambers were soundproofed and isolated, her pleas heard only by technicians following Valkorion's precise instructions. Gradually the begging stopped, replaced by a profound rage that the conditioning could suppress but never fully eliminate. Senya was permitted brief visits, always supervised, during which Vaylin appeared calm and well-treated. The child had learned to wear masks almost as effectively as her father, showing the attending parent what they needed to see while hiding the trauma accumulating beneath. These visits reassured Senya enough that she accepted the doctor's assurances that treatment was progressing well, that her daughter would soon be able to return home fully capable of controlling her extraordinary abilities. When Vaylin finally emerged from the facility years later, she had been fundamentally altered. The bright, energetic child had become something harder and more brittle, her emotions locked behind walls that even she could not fully access. Her power remained immense but constrained, like a sun forced to shine through a tiny aperture. Valkorion declared the treatment successful, and on the surface it appeared he was correct. Vaylin integrated into the family, trained alongside her brothers, and displayed none of the dangerous, uncontrolled manifestations that had characterized her early childhood. But Senya knew her daughter had been broken in ways that might never heal. The woman who returned from that remote moon bore only superficial resemblance to the child who had been taken there. Something vital had been excised from Vaylin's spirit, replaced with barely contained fury that occasionally flashed in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. The worst part was that Vaylin seemed to blame her mother for allowing it to happen, creating a rift between them that would persist for the rest of their lives. The brothers grew into exceptional warriors, their complementary styles making them devastatingly effective when fighting together. The Grinsan's strategic mind and measured approach balanced Arcan's aggressive tactics and overwhelming offensive capability. Valkorion sent them on campaigns throughout wild space, bringing isolated systems under Zakul's influence through a combination of diplomacy and demonstration of superior force. These expeditions served multiple purposes, expanding the Eternal Empire's territory while also giving his sons experience in leadership and combat. During one such campaign, the twins encountered particularly fierce resistance on a world inhabited by predatory species evolved for combat. The local wildlife posed genuine danger even to Force users, creatures that had developed natural resistance to mental manipulation and possessed physical capabilities that challenged even skilled warriors. The Zan and Arcan hunted the planet's apex predator together, bonding through the shared danger in ways that transcended their different personalities. They cornered their quarry in a canyon system that limited maneuverability, turning what should have been a straightforward hunt into desperate close-quarters combat. The creature was massive, armored with natural plating that deflected lightsaber strikes, and possessed enough cunning to set ambushes that caught even the Sand's tactical awareness by surprise. The brothers fought with perfect coordination, Arcan drawing the beast's attention while the Sand maneuvered for killing strikes, then reversing roles when the creature adapted to their strategy. In the final exchange, the predator managed what seemed impossible, breaking through their coordinated defense and catching Thexan with a strike that shattered armor and flesh alike. Arcan watched his brother fall, saw the light leaving Thexan's eyes even as he drove his lightsaber through the creature's skull in a rage-fueled final blow. The beast died instantly, but so did the person Arcan had loved most in the entire galaxy. He carried the Xan's body back to their ship in numb shock, unable to process that his twin, his better half, the brother who had balanced his aggressive nature with wisdom and compassion, was simply gone. The flight back to Zakuul passed in a blur of grief and growing horror at having to deliver this news. The creature's final strike had also torn away part of Arkan's face, destroying one eye and leaving injuries that would scar permanently, but he barely registered the pain. Physical wounds meant nothing compared to the psychic amputation of losing the sibling who had defined half his existence. Valkorion received the news of the Xan's death with a response that shattered something fundamental in Arkan's soul. The Emperor expressed no grief, showed no pain at losing a son he had raised for decades. Instead, he examined the Xan's body with clinical detachment, noting the nature of the injuries and the efficiency of the killing strike. Then he turned to Arkan, surveyed the younger son's wounds, and delivered a verdict that would echo through the scarred prince's mind for years to come. The Gadse was weak. His compassion made him hesitate at the critical moment, and that hesitation killed him. You survived because you are stronger, because you understand that sentiment is a luxury warriors cannot afford. Learn from his failure. No comfort for a son who had just lost his twin. No acknowledgement of grief or validation of loss. Simply a cold assessment that reduced Xan's death to a teaching moment about the dangers of compassion. Arkan stood there, half his face destroyed, his brother's blood still staining his armor, and felt something inside him break as completely as Vaylin had been broken in her conditioning chambers. The desperate need for his father's approval transformed in that moment into something darker and more dangerous. Senya tried to reach her surviving children in the aftermath of the Xan's death, but found them increasingly distant. Arkan withdrew into obsessive training, pushing himself with even more brutal intensity than before, as if trying to become strong enough that nothing could ever hurt him again. Vaylin's carefully maintained control began showing cracks, her conditioning struggling to contain rage that found a new focus in resentment toward a father who had failed all his children in different ways. The family that had once seemed golden and blessed began to fracture under pressures both internal and external. Valkorion appeared not to notice, or perhaps simply did not care. His attention already shifting to other concerns, other projects that existed on timescales, where individual deaths, even of his own children, registered as minor setbacks rather than tragedies. He had lived for 5,000 years. He would live for 5,000 more. What were a few decades of family dysfunction measured against eternity? But Senya noticed, and she began to truly see the being she had devoted her life to serving. Beneath Valkorion's wisdom and power, beneath the benevolent exterior and philosophical teachings, lived something hollow and incapable of authentic connection. He performed the role of father as skillfully as he performed the role of emperor, but both were ultimately just performances. The person she had loved, the immortal she had believed in, might not actually exist at all. Just masks worn by something ancient and terrible that had forgotten how to be genuinely alive somewhere across its impossibly long existence. The year 3637, before the Battle of Yavin arrived, with implications that would cascade across the entire galaxy. The Eternal Empire, which had existed in secret isolation for millennia, finally revealed itself to the wider universe in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. Fleets of vessels unlike anything the Republic or Sith Empire had ever encountered emerged from wild space simultaneously across dozens of contested border systems, their golden hulls gleaming with technological sophistication that made even the most advanced known warships appear primitive by comparison. The Eternal Fleet struck with surgical precision that spoke to perfect intelligence and meticulous planning. Republic and Imperial forces both found themselves outmatched not just in technology, but in tactical coordination that seemed almost prescient. Defensive positions collapsed before commanders could organize effective resistance. Supply lines were severed with strikes that indicated intimate knowledge of logistical networks. Within weeks, both galactic powers faced the reality that a third force had emerged, one that could potentially dominate them both if left unchecked. For the citizens of the Republic and Empire alike, this represented a catastrophic shock. The idea that an advanced civilization had developed in complete isolation, growing powerful enough to challenge the two dominant galactic powers simultaneously, defied everything they understood about how the galaxy functioned. Intelligence services scrambled to gather any information about this eternal empire, about its leadership and origins, but found almost nothing. It was as if an entire civilization had materialized from nowhere, fully formed and overwhelmingly powerful. The being known as the Outlander emerged during this period of chaos and confusion. Whether through the Force's will or simple coincidence, this individual possessed capabilities that drew the attention of both the Republic and Empire, despite the larger conflict consuming galactic resources. Exactly who the Outlander was remained subject to variation, a figure whose specific identity mattered less than what they represented. A wild card. Someone whose actions could not be predicted or controlled by any of the established powers. Through circumstances that varied in the telling, but always involved demonstrating exceptional combat ability and force sensitivity, the Outlander eventually found themselves approaching Zakuul itself. The journey required penetrating defenses that had turned back every other attempt at infiltration, navigating through eternal fleet formations that destroyed conventional attackers with casual efficiency. Yet somehow the Outlander reached the heart of this mysterious empire, driven by determination to confront whoever commanded these forces that threatened the entire galaxy. The throne room of Zakuul stood as a monument to centuries of accumulated power and aesthetic refinement. Golden surfaces reflected light from sources that seemed to have no origin point, creating an ambiance that felt simultaneously welcoming and otherworldly. Geometric patterns in the floor and walls incorporated Zakuulan symbols whose meanings remained obscure to outsiders, but which resonated with subtle force energy that perceptive individuals could sense like a constant low vibration. Valkorion sat upon the eternal throne when the Outlander arrived, his posture relaxed but radiating an authority that filled the enormous chamber. He appeared as he always did to his subjects, a figure of timeless wisdom and strength, someone who had guided Zakuul for so long that many citizens genuinely could not imagine existence without his presence. When he spoke, his voice carried the harmonics that had characterized it for millennia, layers of meaning beneath the surface words that suggested vast depths of experience and knowledge. The confrontation began with Valkorion, offering the Outlander a choice that he had extended to others across his long existence. Kneel and serve, accept a position within the Eternal Empire's hierarchy, and in exchange receive power, purpose, and the opportunity to shape galactic events from a position of unmatched strength. The offer was genuine in its way, though accepting would mean surrendering autonomy to become another tool in Valkorion's incomprehensible designs. The Outlander's refusal was equally genuine, a rejection based on principles that Valkorion had not encountered in anyone who possessed the strength to make such defiance meaningful. This was not the desperate resistance of the weak, easily crushed and forgotten. This was someone who stood before an immortal emperor and chose integrity over power, chose uncertainty over the security of submission. For Valkorion, it represented something almost novel, a reminder of perspectives he had stopped seriously considering millennia ago. What neither of them knew was that Arcan had entered the throne room through a service entrance, moving with the stealth that years of combat training had perfected. His scarred face remained hidden behind the mask he now wore constantly, a helmet that concealed the injuries sustained when Thixan died and had never properly healed. The years since his brother's death had transformed Arcan's desperate need for approval into something far more dangerous. Hatred, pure and focused, directed at the father who had failed to mourn, failed to care, failed to demonstrate any of the basic emotional responses that might have indicated he was actually capable of love. Arkan had spent those years planning this moment, waiting for an opportunity when his father's attention would be divided, when some external factor might create the opening needed to strike at a being whose power normally made assassination unthinkable. The Outlander's presence provided that distraction, holding Valkorion's focus while Arkan approached from behind with a lightsaber, already ignited but held low where the throne's bulk would conceal its glow. The strike was perfect, executed with the skill that decades of obsessive training had developed. Arkan's blade pierced through the throne's back and into Valkorion's chest, with precision that targeted the heart, driving deep enough that energy scorched internal organs and severed vital connections that even force healing would struggle to repair quickly. For anyone else, it would have been instantly fatal. For Valkorion, it represented a genuine surprise, perhaps the first time in millennia that anyone had managed to harm him in a way that actually mattered. Valkorion's expression as he looked down at the lightsaber protruding from his chest was complex, mixing shock with something that might have been understanding or even approval. He turned his head enough to see Arkan standing behind the throne, his son's masked face revealing nothing but the tension in his posture, communicating everything about the emotions driving this patricide. For a moment father and son locked eyes, and in that instant something passed between them that neither the Outlander nor any observer could fully interpret. Then Valkorion's body began to fail, systems shutting down as the lightsaber wound proved too severe to survive, even for someone who had lived 5,000 years. He slumped forward in the throne, blood-staining golden robes, the appearance of mortality settling over features that had seemed eternally vital. Arkan withdrew his weapon and stepped back, watching his father die with an expression hidden behind his mask, but an emotional state that surely mixed triumph with unexpected emptiness. Killing the object of one's hatred should feel like victory, yet somehow it felt hollow, as if the act had failed to deliver the satisfaction it was supposed to provide. The Outlander stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to a situation that had transformed from confrontation to assassination in seconds. Valkorion's death should have been a positive development, eliminating the architect of the Eternal Empire's aggression and potentially creating opportunity to negotiate peace. Yet something about the moment felt wrong, as if events were unfolding according to a script none of them had been permitted to read. Their instincts were correct. As Valkorion's body died, his consciousness executed a maneuver he had prepared for across centuries of studying essence transfer and possession techniques. His spirit, the fundamental awareness that had persisted through 50 centuries by consuming the life force of countless others, tore free from its failing physical vessel and lunged toward the nearest suitable host. The Outlander possessed exceptional force sensitivity and demonstrated mental discipline that suggested they could survive the process of hosting another consciousness. Perfect. The possession happened too quickly for resistance. Valkorion's essence slamming into the Outlander's mind like a physical impact that drove them to their knees. Suddenly, there were two awareness sharing one skull, two sets of memories trying to occupy the same mental space, two wills attempting to control a single body. The Outlander felt their own identity being compressed, pushed aside by something vast and ancient that filled their consciousness like water flooding a sealed chamber. Valkorion's voice echoed inside the Outlander's thoughts, no longer filtered through physical vocal cords, but speaking directly into their awareness with an intimacy that felt violating. How fascinating! After so many millennia in the same vessel, a new perspective, you cannot imagine how rare genuine novelty becomes when you have lived as long as I have. The Outlander tried to scream, to physically reject this intrusion, but their body no longer responded entirely to their commands. They could feel Valkorion examining their memories like someone browsing through documents, casually violating the most private moments of their life with the detached curiosity of a researcher studying interesting specimens. The violation was absolute, a form of assault that went beyond anything physical into the realm of fundamental identity. Arkan watched the Outlander collapse, saw them writhing on the throne room floor as they fought an internal battle against an invader none of the observers could perceive. He recognized that something had gone wrong, that his carefully planned assassination had somehow failed to achieve its purpose, despite his father's body lying dead on the throne. Valkorion had escaped again, transformed defeat into some new configuration that Arkan could not fully understand, but knew with certainty he had not truly won. Security forces loyal to Arkan rushed into the throne room, responding to alerts triggered by the combat and their emperor's death. They found the scarred prince standing over his father's corpse, the Outlander incapacitated on the floor, and a situation that defied simple explanation. Arkan made a decision in that moment that would define the coming years. He claimed the eternal throne for himself, declared that Valkorion had been killed by the Outlander in an assassination attempt, and assumed control of the Eternal Empire with the authority of the only surviving legitimate heir. The Outlander was imprisoned, locked in a stasis chamber that would preserve them indefinitely, while Arkan consolidated power and decided what to do with someone who had somehow survived his father's death, yet clearly posed a continued threat. Vaylin supported her brother's coup, seeing opportunity to finally escape the constraints that had defined her existence under Valkorion's rule. Senya, horrified by everything that had transpired, found herself torn between maternal love for her children and recognition that they were embarking on a path that could only end in further tragedy. Inside the Outlander's mind, Valkorion settled into his new accommodation, examining the parameters of this prison that was simultaneously an opportunity. He was trapped inside another consciousness, unable to act independently, but he was also free from the physical vulnerabilities that had just resulted in his body's death. This was not the ending he had planned, but he had lived far too long to believe that plans ever survived contact with reality unchanged. Adaptation was the key to persistence across millennia. He would adapt to this new circumstance, learn its possibilities and limitations, and eventually find a way to turn captivity into advantage. He always had before. The Outlander eventually escaped their imprisonment through circumstances that involved allies they had made before confronting Valkorion, individuals who had their own reasons to oppose the Eternal Empire's conquest. But freedom from physical captivity meant nothing when consciousness itself remained occupied by an unwanted presence. Everywhere the Outlander went, Valkorion was there, observing through their eyes, commenting on their choices, offering guidance that felt more like manipulation. The relationship between them evolved into something neither could have anticipated. Valkorion could not directly control the Outlander's actions. Discovering that their mental discipline created barriers, even his vast experience struggled to overcome. Forced possession required the host to be weak-willed or broken, conditions that did not apply. Instead, he existed as a presence, a voice that could not be silenced, a perspective that colored every experience even when the Outlander consciously rejected his input. For someone who had spent 5,000 years acting with complete autonomy, directing empires and shaping galactic events according to his uncontested will, this limitation represented a novel experience. Valkorion found himself in the position of advisor rather than commander, forced to persuade rather than compel. Initially, he approached this as a temporary inconvenience, assuming he would eventually find a method to overcome the Outlander's resistance and claim full control. But as time passed, something unexpected happened. The Outlander's perspective, their way of engaging with the galaxy and making decisions based on principles rather than pure pragmatism, created friction against Valkorion's ancient certainties. They demonstrated loyalty to companions that brought no obvious tactical advantage. They made sacrifices for people who could offer nothing in return. They cared about outcomes beyond their own survival and advancement. These behaviors should have seemed like weakness to Valkorion, exploitable flaws that demonstrated why mortals remained inferior to immortal planning. Yet watching these choices play out, seeing their consequences ripple through situations in ways his calculations had not predicted, created small cracks in assumptions Valkorion had held for millennia. When the Outlander showed mercy to a defeated enemy, and that enemy later provided critical intelligence that saved lives, it challenged his certainty that mercy was always weakness. When they trusted a companion despite obvious risks, and that trust was rewarded with loyalty that proved decisive in crucial moments, it questioned his belief that trust was merely calculated risk assessment. These were not revelations that transformed Valkorion's fundamental nature, not redemptive moments that suddenly made him regret 5,000 years of ruthless manipulation and genocide. But they created space for something he had not experienced in longer than he could remember: doubt. The possibility, however remote, that his understanding of how power and purpose functioned might be incomplete. Their conversations in the mindscape they shared became strange philosophical duels where neither participant could claim complete victory. The Outlander challenged Valkorion's assertions about strength and survival, forcing him to defend positions he had never needed to articulate because no one had possessed the combination of power and courage to question them. Valkorion, in turn, exposed the Outlander to perspectives that spanned thousands of years, demonstrating how principles that seemed absolute became complicated when applied across the timescales of civilizations rather than individual lifetimes. The mental space where these conversations occurred manifested as a kind of palace architecture built from Valkorion's memories and imposing itself on the shared consciousness. Golden halls stretched into impossible distances, decorated with artifacts from civilizations the Outlander had never heard of because they had risen and fallen during Valkorion's lifetime. Walking through these corridors meant encountering fragments of 5,000 years of accumulated experience, each object or image carrying significance that would require hours of explanation to fully understand. Sometimes, in unguarded moments, Valkorion revealed aspects of his existence that he had never shared with anyone. He spoke about the isolation of immortality, how watching everyone around you age and die while you persisted created a fundamental disconnect from normal existence. He described the way memories accumulated until they stopped feeling like personal experiences and became more like historical records he had happened to witness. He admitted that he could no longer remember what genuine surprise felt like, that after 5 millennia, almost everything seemed like variations on patterns he had already observed countless times. These admissions came reluctantly, as if acknowledging them violated something fundamental to how he had constructed his identity. But trapped in another consciousness, unable to act independently, Valkorion found himself in a position where pretense served no purpose. The Outlander was going to perceive his thoughts whether he wished it or not, was going to sense the vast emptiness beneath his carefully maintained facade of purpose and control. Outside their shared headspace, the galaxy continued tearing itself apart under Arcanon's increasingly tyrannical rule. The new emperor lacked his father's patient strategic genius, substituting brutal force for subtle manipulation. He drove the Eternal Empire toward total war against both Republic and Sith, seeking to prove through conquest that he was worthy of the throne he had claimed through patricide. But each victory felt hollow, each subjugated world just another entry in a list that brought no satisfaction, no sense that he was achieving anything except his father's goals through less efficient methods. Valen served her brother initially, commanding forces with a ferocity that terrified even hardened soldiers. But the mental conditioning that had constrained her power for so long was beginning to fail under the stress of constant combat and the absence of Valkorion's presence reinforcing it. She started experiencing breakthrough moments when her full abilities manifested uncontrollably, destroying friend and foe alike in eruptions of force energy that left devastation in their wake. Senya watched her children descend into patterns that echoed their father's worst qualities while lacking his competence. She reached out to the Outlander, recognizing that this individual who had survived Valkorion's possession might be the key to preventing complete catastrophe. Her knowledge of the Eternal Empire's internal workings, combined with the Outlanders' growing coalition of Republic and Imperial forces willing to cooperate against the common threat, created the foundation for genuine resistance. During the campaigns against Arcan's forces, Valkorion proved unexpectedly useful, offering tactical advice drawn from millennia of military experience. He identified weaknesses in Eternal Empire deployments that no conventional analysis would have caught, suggested strategies that turned apparent defeats into costly victories. The Outlander learned to separate his guidance from his manipulation, accepting useful information while rejecting attempts to influence larger decisions about mercy, justice, and the proper treatment of defeated enemies. This collaboration created a strange dynamic. Two beings who should have been absolute enemies, sharing headspace and occasionally working toward aligned goals while maintaining fundamental opposition on almost every principle. Valkorion wanted to reclaim his empire, to continue existence on his own terms. The Outlander wanted to free the galaxy from tyranny, regardless of who imposed it. Their goals aligned temporarily regarding Arcan's removal, but both understood that resolution of their shared consciousness would eventually require confrontation. Valen's conditioning finally shattered completely during a battle where stress and rage combined to overwhelm the mental barriers that had contained her since childhood. The release was catastrophic, her power manifesting with an intensity that killed everyone within several hundred meters regardless of allegiance. She stood at the center of the devastation, feeling truly free for the first time since those terrible years in her father's facility, and the sensation was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Freed from constraint, Valen claimed the Eternal Throne for herself, overthrowing Arcan in a confrontation that demonstrated the vast gulf between his skill and her unrestrained potential. She became Empress, and under her rule, the Eternal Empire's aggression escalated to suicidal levels. Where Valkorion had been patient and Arcan brutal, Valen was chaos incarnate, making decisions based on whim and fury rather than any coherent strategy. Arcan, cast down from the throne he had killed to claim, found himself in the unexpected position of exile. Senya located him, managed to reach the broken man her son had become, and slowly began the process of helping him confront what he had done and who he had become. This redemption arc was painful and incomplete, requiring Arcan to accept responsibility for atrocities committed in pursuit of proving worth to a father who had been fundamentally incapable of providing the validation he sought. Inside the Outlander's mind, Valkorion observed these developments with emotions he could not quite categorize. Valen's freedom should have concerned him, her uncontrolled power representing exactly the threat he had spent years trying to prevent. Yet he felt something that might have been pride watching her seize control so decisively. Arcan's potential redemption should have seemed irrelevant, yet the idea that his son might find purpose beyond hatred held unexpected appeal. These were not the thoughts of the being who had consumed Nathema, who had built empires through patient manipulation across millennia. They were cracks in a facade that had persisted for 5,000 years, signs that even an immortal consciousness could be changed by circumstances beyond its control. Valkorion recognized what was happening to him, understood that prolonged exposure to the Outlander's perspective was eroding certainties he had built his entire existence upon, but found himself unable or perhaps unwilling to prevent the process. The Outlander noticed these changes too, caught glimpses of the person Valkorion might have been before Nathema's ritual transformed him into something hollow and vast. They began to understand that immortality had not been a triumph but a tragedy, that the being currently sharing their consciousness had sacrificed everything that made existence meaningful in exchange for the empty prize of persistence. Power without purpose, existence without growth, an eternity spent repeating patterns that had stopped providing satisfaction millennia ago. The confrontation with Valen came to its inevitable conclusion on Zakayul itself, as the Outlanders' coalition forces fought their way through the Eternal Fleet's defensive formations toward the Throne World. The battle raged across orbital platforms and through the Golden City's streets, Republic and Imperial soldiers fighting alongside each other against Eternal Empire forces who had grown weary under Valen's increasingly erratic leadership. Many Zakiulans had begun to question whether their empress truly served their interests or had simply become another tyrant wielding power without wisdom. Valen met the assault with the full terrifying scope of her abilities finally unleashed. She stood atop the palace steps and tore attacking ships from the sky, with gestures that seemed almost casual, her power reaching into orbit to crush hulls and scatter debris across the city below. Soldiers who approached too closely found themselves lifted and broken by invisible force, their bodies discarded like toys that had ceased to amuse her. This was the potential Valkorion had feared, the reason he had subjected his daughter to years of conditioning. Now it manifested without restraint or control. The Outlander fought their way through this chaos, supported by companions who had become genuine friends during the long campaign against the Eternal Empire. Senya was among them, a mother preparing to face her daughter in combat, knowing that one of them would likely not survive the encounter. Arkan had chosen to come as well, his redemption incomplete, but his commitment to stopping the cycle of violence his family had perpetrated now genuine. When the Outlander finally reached Valen in the throne room, the confrontation was brief but devastating. She fought with abandon that came from having nothing left to lose, every attack channeling power that distorted reality around her. The throne room's golden surfaces cracked under the stress of energies being channeled through physical space not designed to contain such forces. Structural supports groaned as the very building protested the battle occurring within it. But for all her raw strength, Valen had never received the training that might have taught her discipline and strategy. Her conditioning had prevented proper development during the years when such fundamentals should have been instilled. She was immensely powerful but tactically predictable, burning bright and fast without the calculated precision that made lesser force users dangerous. The Outlander, guided by experience gained across years of warfare and with Valkorion's reluctant tactical advice echoing in their mind, found openings that someone with proper training would never have allowed. The killing stroke was quick, almost merciful given the alternatives. Valen fell, her expression in that final moment mixing surprise with something that might have been relief. As life fled, the rage that had sustained her since childhood finally released its grip, leaving behind only exhaustion. Senya reached her daughter's side as consciousness faded, cradling Valen's head and whispering apologies for failures that could never be remedied. The young woman who had been broken by her father's fear died in her mother's arms, finally free from both the conditioning that had crippled her and the fury that had consumed her once freed. Inside the Outlander's consciousness, Valkorion experienced Valen's death through their perceptions and felt something crack in the carefully maintained emotional distance he had preserved for millennia. This was his daughter, a being he had created and then systematically destroyed because her potential threatened his supremacy. He had told himself it was necessary, that controlling her power was the only logical choice. But watching her die, sensing through the Outlander's force awareness the way her spirit departed, carrying nothing but pain and wasted potential, he could not maintain the fiction that his choices had been justified. The moment passed quickly, Valkorion reasserting control over emotional responses that served no useful purpose. There were larger concerns demanding attention. With Valen dead and Arkan's redemption removing him as a threat, only the Outlander stood between Valkorion and reclaiming control of the Eternal Empire. The time had come for the final confrontation between the two, consciousness sharing one mind. Valkorion initiated the assault from within, no longer offering advice or attempting persuasion, but simply trying to seize complete control through overwhelming force of will. The Outlander felt their sense of self compressing under pressure from something vast and ancient, as if an ocean had decided to force itself into a container meant for a single cup of water. The physical world faded as the real battle shifted entirely into mental space, consciousness fighting consciousness for dominance of a single body. The mindscape that had been Valkorion's palace, began to shatter and reform according to the conflict playing out within it. Golden halls collapsed into abstract spaces where conventional geometry stopped applying. Fragments of Valkorion's memories manifested as weapons and shields, 5,000 years of accumulated experience deployed against the Outlander's much shorter but intensely lived lifetime. Every person the Outlander had failed, every mistake they had made, every doubt they had harbored became ammunition in Valkorion's assault. But the Outlander possessed something Valkorion had long ago sacrificed. They could still grow, still change, still form genuine connections that went beyond calculated utility. The companions who had fought alongside them, the principles they had maintained even when pragmatism suggested compromise, the capacity to feel authentic emotions rather than merely remembering what emotions used to be like. All of this created a foundation that Valkorion's vast power could not simply overwhelm through brute force. The battle raged across subjective hours that passed as seconds in the physical world. Valkorion deployed techniques refined across millennia, methods of mental domination that had broken the strongest wills in galactic history. The Outlander resisted with desperate innovation, finding defenses in places Valkorion did not think to attack because his ancient patterns had calcified into predictable approaches despite their sophistication. In the midst of this struggle, truths began emerging that neither participant had fully acknowledged even to themselves. Valkorion's assault carried within it the accumulated weight of 5,000 years of isolation, the desperate need to prove that his choices had meaning, that his existence served some purpose beyond merely continuing to exist. He had told himself for millennia that he sought ultimate power, perfect control over the galaxy, and possibly over the Force itself. But confronting the Outlander's resistance forced him to recognize what he had actually been pursuing all along. He wanted to stop, wanted an end to the endless continuation, to the cycle of consumption and persistence that had long ago stopped feeling like life and become mere mechanical maintenance of consciousness. But he could not grant himself that ending. An immortal who consumed life to sustain existence could not simply choose to die. His very nature prevented it, the stolen vitality of 8,000 Sith Lords and countless others sustaining him regardless of what he consciously desired. The realization hit with crushing force that momentarily disrupted his assault. Everything he had done across 50 centuries, all the empires built and destroyed, all the lives consumed and manipulated, all the elaborate plans spanning millennia, had been nothing more than attempts to either justify his existence or find someone strong enough to end it for him. The anathema ritual had not been triumph but tragedy. Achieving immortality had not liberated him, but created a prison from which he could not escape no matter how powerful he became. The Outlander sensed this recognition, felt the shift in Valkorion's assault from overwhelming aggression to something more complex. They pushed back not just with resistance but with understanding, forcing Valkorion to confront what he had become and why every achievement across 5,000 years had ultimately left him empty. Power meant nothing when you could no longer remember why you wanted it. Immortality was worthless when existence itself had become burden rather than gift. Valkorion's final gambit was not another assault but an offer. Give him control of the body, let him subsume the Outlander's consciousness completely, and in exchange he would use their combined power to reshape the galaxy according to principles the Outlander valued. He could build the peaceful civilization they envisioned, could eliminate tyranny and injustice across countless worlds. All it required was surrendering individual existence to become part of something greater. The temptation was real. The Outlander could sense that Valkorion was not lying, that he genuinely would attempt to fulfill this promise if given the chance. But they could also sense the trap beneath the offer. Valkorion had made similar promises before, to the Sith he had led into exile, to the people of Zakul, perhaps even to himself 5,000 years ago on Nathema. He would start with good intentions, but the fundamental emptiness at his core would eventually corrupt everything he touched. Power wielded by someone who had forgotten how to genuinely care could only create monuments to that absence. The Outlander refused, choosing uncertain freedom over promised perfection. They gathered everything they had learned about the Force, about themselves, about the nature of life and death, and the courage required to accept endings. Then they struck not at Valkorion's power, but at the core of what sustained him, the stolen life force from Nathema that had anchored his existence for 50 centuries. Valkorion felt the assault reaching toward foundations he had assumed were untouchable, and recognized with sudden clarity what was about to happen. This was not defeat at the hands of a stronger enemy. This was the ending he had unconsciously sought across 5,000 years of elaborate maneuvering. The Outlander was strong enough, principled enough, and positioned perfectly to do what he could not do for himself. Grant release from the prison of eternal existence. He could have resisted, could have deployed reserves of power that might have overwhelmed the Outlander's attack. But in that final moment, Valkorion chose instead to let go. For the first time since standing alone on dead Nathema, surrounded by the drained corpses of 8,000 betrayed Sith Lords, he made a choice that was not about accumulating power or extending existence, but simply about accepting that some things were meant to end. The dissolution began with the life force stolen from Nathema, that vast reservoir of consumed vitality finally releasing after 50 centuries of imprisonment. The Outlander felt it flooding through them, not as power to be claimed, but as lives finally freed to return to the cosmic force. Thousands of distinct awareness that had been trapped within Valkorion's consciousness emerged like prisoners escaping a collapsed structure, each one carrying memories of who they had been before being consumed. Valkorion's own essence began fragmenting as the foundation sustaining it crumbled. He experienced something he had not felt since childhood on Nathema before the ritual. Genuine fear, not of threats that could be calculated and countered, but of the absolute unknown that comes with cessation of consciousness. For 5,000 years, he had existed with certainty of continuation. Now that certainty vanished, leaving only the question that every mortal faces and that his immortality had allowed him to avoid. What comes after? His final words echoed through the mindscape as his presence dissolved like morning fog under rising sun. At last I am free. Free from the burden of eternity, from the emptiness that immortality creates. You have given me what I could never grant myself. Thank you. Whether those words represented genuine gratitude or simply a final manipulation designed to leave the Outlander questioning their choice remained ambiguous to the end. Then Valkorion was gone, his consciousness fragmenting and dispersing into the Force, 5,000 years of accumulated awareness, finally experiencing the death he had worked so hard to prevent and eventually come to desperately desire. The Outlander collapsed in the physical world, suddenly alone in their own mind for the first time in years. The absence was shocking, like the silence after constant noise or emptiness after prolonged pressure. They carried Valkorion's memories now, not as a living presence, but as knowledge integrated into their own consciousness. 5,000 years of experience had become part of their understanding, a perspective they could access, but which no longer possessed independent will. Senya found them there, still kneeling beside Valen's body, and understood from their expression that something fundamental had changed. The Outlander explained as best they could what had transpired, how Valkorion had finally been destroyed or released, or perhaps had simply chosen to stop fighting against the inevitable. Senya listened and felt a complex mixture of grief and relief. The being who had been her companion, the father of her children, the Immortal Emperor she had served was truly gone. Whatever he had been at the end, whether monster or tragic figure or something too complex for simple categorization, his story had finally reached its conclusion. The Eternal Empire fragmented in the aftermath, its citizens uncertain how to proceed without the immortal leadership that had defined their civilization for millennia. Some systems chose to integrate with the Republic, others maintained independence. A few aligned with the reformed Sith Empire that was attempting to move beyond cycles of endless warfare. Zakul itself entered a period of profound transformation, its people grappling with questions about identity and purpose that Valkorion's presence had allowed them to avoid. Arkan and Senya both survived, choosing paths of quiet service, attempting to remediate some small portion of the damage their family had inflicted across generations. They would never fully succeed, could never bring back those killed or repair all that had been broken, but the attempt itself held meaning. They had learned what Valkorion never could, that redemption lies not in grand gestures or ultimate victory, but in persistent small efforts to create more light than darkness. The Outlander carried Valkorion's legacy forward in ways both troubling and valuable. His memories provided insight into Force techniques and historical events that no living being should possess, knowledge that could serve great good or enable terrible harm, depending on how it was applied. They had to constantly examine their own motivations, questioning whether choices came from their authentic self or from patterns absorbed from the immortal consciousness they had hosted. In quiet moments, the Outlander sometimes wondered about Valkorion's final words, whether he had truly found peace in dissolution, or simply ceased to exist with the same emotional void that had characterized his last millennia of life. There was no way to know, no method to determine if consciousness persisted in some form after returning to the Force, or simply ended. Perhaps that uncertainty was itself the point, the acceptance of unknowable outcomes that separated mortal wisdom from immortal arrogance. 3 identities, one eternal spirit, seeking an end it could never grant itself, until someone else proved strong enough to deliver that final mercy. Tenebrae the patricidal child, Vitiate the Sith Emperor, Valkorion the Golden King, all masks worn by something that had forgotten what lived beneath them, if anything remained at all. His story spanned 5,000 years, touched billions of lives, and ultimately demonstrated a truth that echoed across all the galaxy's long history. Power without wisdom becomes prison, and immortality without growth is just another form of death.